Welcome, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'asot b'mitzvotav. So we actually have some really beautiful passages and beautiful Rashis to look at today, and of course I love the fact how Rashi and reflecting the tradition just gives us such a deeper understanding of the literary quality, the understanding of scripture. So let's get started. I don't know that I made my bracha. I don't think I did. So, Baruch atah.
Yes, you did.
I did. Look at that. Short-term memory loss. On display and recorded.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, me. Vayomer Balak el Bilam. So we know what's been going on up to now. You know, Balak has hired Bilam at quite a price and for a lot of honor, etc. And Bilam has totally skunked him. Okay, so Vayomer Balak el Bilam. So Balak said to Bilam, Gam kov lo tekovenu, gam barech lo tevarachem. He says, neither curse him nor bless him. And Rashi's going to explain that this is sort of an interesting. This Gam-Gam in Hebrew is a stylistic way in which Hebrew equates or rather compares two things. So it's either in a positive sense because it's Gam law, right, and Gam law. So here it means neither. If there weren't the law, it would mean either, or in Americanese, either. So this is basically the point that Rashi makes. Let's make sure I'm pronouncing this correctly. Right, Gam Kov. There's no Vav there, so Gam Kov Lekabel. Gam Rishon Rusat El Gam Hashem. So he says the first Gam is added to the second quote quote Gam. The Gam Sheni El Gam Rishon. And you add the second Gam to the first Gam. So in other words, he's saying, that we put the two together. And he says, likewise, we have a similar idiomatic or grammatical expression in the first book of Kings, chapter 3, Gam li, Gam lacha. And this is the famous story of the two women who come before King Solomon with one who lay upon her baby and suffocated it, and the other one who has the living baby, and they come to King Solomon for a decision. And the first one, of course, wants her baby back, and the other one says to King Solomon, right, it will be, it says, we shouldn't give the baby to our ones. We should take the baby. So Gamli, nor to me, nor to you, Lohi. And likewise, again, it's similar kinds of grammatic expressions in Deuteronomy 32. Gam Bahur, Gam Betula. Right? So it means both male, or both a young man and a young woman. Vayan Bilam, and Bilam responded to Balak and said, Vayomer El Balak, he said to Balak, Halo dibarti elecha. Indeed, I already told you, my Lord, saying, Kol asher yidaber Hashem kol ha'aseh. There's everything which the Lord speaks, I will perform. No watching. Think that. Yeah. Vayomer Balak Odo. Sir, Balak said, Lechana, go, ekachacha, I will take you, El Makom there, to a different place, allow Yishar B'nei Elohim, perhaps to go simplicity in the eyes of God, or Kavletor Lisham, and that you curse the Israelites from that particular place. So again, this is not the first time Balak has said, well, let's change position and maybe the situation will differ. And Rashi is going to go into a little bit as we proceed as to what was in Balak's mind. So, and you shall curse for me. Ein ze lashon tzivui. So he says this isn't a command, this isn't an imperative. Kamo the kavno. So it will be the kovno, first step, right? So it means, and you will, right? Ella lashonati, but it is an imperfect, it's in the imperfect, let's see, yes, it's imperfect. In other words, not completed action, which we generally commonly call the future, right? So it's an expression of future ulai, perhaps. Yishar, it will be appropriate, right? That enough in his eyes, in other words, in God's eyes, that to kavenu lishon, and that you will be able to curse him for me there. And Rashi gives the French word maldier, right? So it sounds very similar to modern French, right? Mal, of course, means bad. Speak, dear, to delay, to speak. So speak ill, alas, in French. This particular edition puts in the Yiddish, du sollst fluchen, you shall curse. Going on. Vayikach Balak took et Bilam, Rosh HaPa'or, to the top of Pa'or, Anishkaf, which looks out al Pnei Ha'yishimon, looks out on the surface of the wilderness, on the face of the wilderness. Take a look at Rosh, the top of Pa'or. Kosem Gadol Haya Balak. The truth is that Balak was a great wizard. He saw in his years wizardry She'ain Atidim Lekot Al Yedei Pa'or, that in the future the Israelites would be damaged, right? They would be punished by means of what was happening at Pa'or, by what they did at Pa'or. V'lo haya yodea, but he didn't know Bameh through what means. He didn't really know in what way they would be harmed, they would be cursed. Amar, he thought, Shema Aklala Tahur Alehem, possibly the curse will rest upon them. Mesham, from there, in this place called Nahor, a period. The same Kolachazim, and likewise, in a similar way, all those seers, the Kochavim, right, who look at stars, the astrologers, they see the angel but they don't really know what they say. They're able to perceive, but they don't really understand what they perceive. So Bilam says to Balak, so build there for me 7 altars, and prepare for me on it Shiva Parim, 7 bulls, Shiva Elim, and 7 rams. Now, I am sure that there is symbolism involved in the number 7 and in the fact that they're offering up bulls and rams. I know that bulls represent Abraham elsewhere, and rams, of course, represent Isaac. The number 7, of course, I understand and I associate with the world, the creation of the world, which was created in 7 days. But in terms of getting a better and a deeper understanding of why this was being done, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Whether or not the idea was to somehow mitigate Abraham, the power of Abraham and Isaac in some way. Notice that, by the way, lambs represent Jacob, goats represent the Joseph, because of course the brothers, when they were going to trick their father into believing that Joseph had died. Remember, they slaughtered a lamb and dipped his coat in the blood, etc. So goats represent, because they're also offered as offerings in Jewish worship, Israelite worship. That's what these animals represent. There is a really strong connection, despite the fact that these people are no longer around. There is a deep, deep connection with our ancestors and I think a realization that we are on their shoulders, that we are who we are because of our ancestors. There's a really a very positive awareness of this. So let's see. I don't know the case. I don't know. Just Rashi to the end. This check. So by here we are. Vayas Balak, and Balak performed Kasher Amar Bilam, just as Bilam had said. Vayal Par V'ayal Mizbeach, and he offered up a bull and a ram on each altar, is what it would be. So please, if you have any questions or comments, please, of course, feel free to comment. Okay, so we're going to go ahead. Vayar Bilam, Bilam saw, he told Hashem Mevarech et Israel. He saw that it was fitting in the eyes of God to bless Israel. Now, the word tov also has the sense of something that can be judged. In other words, if it can be judged as good, there has to be a sense in which it's finished, right? In other words, that it was a final decision on God's part to bless Israel. The lo halach b'pa'ah, so he did not follow as he had in previous times, mikrat nefashim, to try to use spells. Literally, that means to go after, something like that, or to greet. Vayashit el kamidbar kanav, and he turned his face towards the wilderness. You see, Vayar Bilam, he saw that it was good. In other words, it was determined, I guess would be a good way to translate this. Amar, he thought, I don't need to test again. I don't need to check again. Because he has no desire. In other words, I don't need to test God. I know myself. This is not, God is not going to test. So he didn't follow his previous, practice. And so Rashi points out that the palm, he says, can be understood literally as he had done two previous times. The krat nefashim, in other words, to go after spells, things like that. And the chesh, in other words, to suspect. That's how he understands it. So he understands, Rashi's telling us that even though the word nefashim definitely can have to do with spells, but lenachesh means also to suspect or to try something like that, right? Lenachesh, to suspect, rely, Hashem that possibly God would happen on him. In other words, that the spirit of prophecy might happen. There's in the intention of the word that this is with a letter A, right? And A's and Yuds are interchangeable. And there's a word mikra, which means a chance happening. So that's what this means. In other words, that there was a chance that the Lord would meet him, so to speak. Kirtzano would meet him as he wished. So that's, in other words, he did not have to test that anymore. Amar, he thought. So in other words, thinking, the Lord says, so he thought to himself, whether he wants to or whether he doesn't want to, whether God wants to or doesn't want to, lakvalam, to curse them, a skill of them. In other words, I'm going to take a different approach, and I will make mention of their iniquities, of the Jewish people. In other words, if I can somehow bring to mind before God and declare before God the iniquities of the Jewish people, and so the curse, for the reason, the mention of their iniquities, it will happen. It will fall upon them. That way the curse will fall upon them. So in other words, I'm not going to try and curse them directly, but I'm going to do it sort of tangentially and then allow the fact that when people act in iniquitous ways, bad things happen to them, they get judged, etc. And so that's the way I will first wind up cursing Jewish people. And he turned his face towards the wilderness. And Rashi says, Ketar Gomo. Right? So here it is, the Shavi Lemad Torah Hapovi. So it says, and he turned, literally it means he turned his face towards the wilderness. Now, the Vayashet here, right, is perhaps what Rashi is concerned about, right? That in terms of how we would understand it. So I think the word Vayashet is related to a word, believe me or not, it's a very different kind of root, vasim, right? It means to place, right? Whereas, let's see, whereas the shavi, I guess, apodi, has a better sense in the Aramaic of turning his face. So just thoughts about why Rashi would have said what he said. Vayisa Bilam now, and Bilam lifted up his eyes, Vayar it Israel, and he saw the Israelites, Israel, Shochem Mishpatav, and dwelling according to the tribes, and arranged according to the tribes, and they were situated. But to be allowed with him, and the Spirit of God came upon him. So, fine. Nice, here we go. Vayisa Bilam. Bilam literally means he lifted up his eyes. Bikesh lachnis bahem ayin raha. So, in other words, why does it make ayin? And we understand this deeper sense that he sought to turn the evil eye against them. So, I think there's actually in Italian expression mal ocho, and what it means is looking on something with hatred and wishing ill upon that particular thing. And that's the evil eye. The evil eye is when someone looks at something with malice and a desire to see something bad happen. And so obviously they felt there was a strong spiritual power to that kind of feeling. V'harei yesh lacha shalosh midotav. And so you have, there are actually three bad qualities that he had. Just shalosh midotav simply means his God's three qualities. What were those qualities? Ayin ra'a, in other words, this jealousy, this hatred of other people's success, etc. Baruch Gvoha, which basically I understand as arrogance or false pride, when nefesh rechava, and greed, ha'amurim lamala, which I mentioned above. In other words, we see some of these things when Balak initially comes to hire Bilam to curse the Jewish people, and the idea that he says to Bilam, to Balak, if you gave me all your treasures, I would do it. So why is he thinking of even things like that? So that has to do with his greed. And he also, Balak promises him great honor, etc. So again, the need to have great honor. So I mentioned Lamala, it's mentioned also in Pirkei Avot, in chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot, they talk about the qualities of Bilam, these three bad qualities: arrogance, and this sense of malice towards others, and greed. Shochen Lishmatav. So again, what's the significance of the fact that the Israelite encampment was dwelling according to their tribes? What was the deal? Why was that so good? Ra'ah, he saw, Kol Shevet v'Shevet, that each and every tribe, Shochen La'atzmo, that they were separated out into their specific encampments. Ve'einam Orvim. So he saw that they didn't commingle, that they retained the integrity of their, of their identity. So I'm not sure if that also means in terms of practices, in terms of sexuality, etc. But anyway, the Orvin means to mix together. So just have to play with that as to what the significance of that. Ra'ah, he saw, she'en tachtifeihem mekuvanim zeh keneged zeh. He saw that the openings of the tents were not opposite one another. In other words, the opening of one tent wasn't right opposite the opening of another tent. Shelo yatzitz le'toch bo'er hameyor, so that one person couldn't peer into the tent whose fellow. In other words, sort of the peeping Tom syndrome. And we saw that they weren't interested in trying to gossip and see what each one was doing in privacy. So there we are. We have a sense of the value of maintaining people's modesty and privacy and respecting people's privacy right here in this particular sentence. But to hear Allah Ruach Elohim, and the Spirit of God resting upon him, Allah believable. So what do we mean by that? In other words, again, Rashi is saying, what do we mean exactly by what was the significance of the fact that the Torah is mentioning that the significance of God rested upon him? It says, Allah believable, it arose in his heart, Shalor Yikalallah, that he shouldn't curse them. So that Spirit of God was the one that gave Bilam the sense of not cursing. But he saw the shalom that he carried, literally it means he carried his shal, his metaphor. So it's, in other words, and so we're talking about the burden of his prophecy, etc. At Yimar, he said, Bilam, the statement of Bilam, the or. So it means, literally, we know it means the son of the or, but the or could mean or his son. So Rashi is going to comment on this sort of unusual expression here. When the hagever and the statement of the man shtum ha'ayin, and again, what does shtum, this word shtum ha'ayin of I? So we're going to have to look at the Rashi to understand. Now, Uncle is right here, the Shapir Chazeh, he translates the word shtum as Shapir means excellent, Chazeh, who sees excellently, who has excellent vision. Take a look at this. The Nobor. So he says this is similar to an expression. This is a stylistic issue in Psalm 114, and it says Lamai no mine. So you see the ma. So literally it should be the ma'ayan mine, to spring to as or my name mine. It should be springs of water. But this vav at the end, right, is a monomial suffix of third person. So again, he's simply saying it's in a way a poetic way of saying the my name mine. Midrash agadah, but there's also a midrashic exposition of this that one can list. It's found in Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin, page 105. Shnehem hayigdolim me'avotihem. In other words, both Bilam and let's see, right. So that both Balak and Bilam were greater than their fathers. That's what it's saying, not what they had. Balak b'no Tzipor. So when we talk about Balak b'no Tzipor, we use that expression. Aviv b'nohu, we could say that his father, that is Balak's father, Tzipor, b'nohu b'nochud, was his son when it came to sovereignty. In other words, he was lesser of a sovereign than Balak. Bilam gadol me'avav b'neviut, and likewise Bilam was greater than his father when it came to prophecy. Maneh ben Baras Hayam. In other words, he himself was a maneh, a coin, the son of a half coin. That's how we would say it. Again, using it metaphorically, that they were much greater than their father. So now we get to Shtum Ha'ayin. It's another part of the verse that we need to try to understand. So he says, and this is of course basically on what Rashi has read in the Talmud, Abu Dazar, it's mentioned, right? Eino Nekura, his eye had been removed. Almost 8. taken out. Lachutz, outside, it had been removed entirely. The Chor Shema and the socket, its socket, was seen open. The Lashon Mishnahu, and this word Shatum is found in the Mishnah, in Mishnah Hebrew. And here we go, Avodah Zarah Samachet, the tractate Avodah Zarah, page 69. Okay, Kedam, it is worth Sheyishtom V'yistom. It's worth opening, but sealing, and drying. So again, the context for that I'm not certain of, but at any rate, there's the word shatum, meaning to open. The Rabbeinu Amru, and as I said, the Fisha Amar, because he had thought, U'mesacher Misfar, Misacher et Roba Yisrael, right? He says it has to do with to count. Remember et Roba Yisrael, what it's referring to is the intercourses of the Jewish people, Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu, that the Holy One basically Yoshev Umaneh Revi'u Tehem Shel Yisrael, that the Holy One sits and he counts the intercourses of the Jewish people. We'll see in what context we're talking about. Matai Tavo Tifa Shenolah HaTzadik, as to when this, in other words, Tifa means drop, but it's referring to the sperm, Shenolah HaTzadik, let's see, Mimenas, the word here, from which the tzaddik would be born, and I'm not sure if he's referring here to Moses, right? So that's that's a statement that was made in the prophecy, and that's how we're understanding that's what was in mind in that statement. Amar Belibo, so he made that statement, but in his heart he thought, Mi Shavu Kadosh U'Mishaltav Kadoshim, someone who is so holy and his servants are holy, in other words, the angels, Yistakel Udvarim Halalu, that such a holy one should care about that and should be looking at such things. But al davar zeh, and regarding this matter, nistom ino, his eye was blinded. Bilam. So in other words, he was talking about God looking, and as I'm understanding this, because it's somewhat ambiguous, all right, does it mean he should never have said such things, or does it say that actually for God to be aware of such things is perfectly fine, that's part of God's omniscience, etc. And because he questioned God's looking, his eye was taken out, right? He questioned whether God would look at such things. So that's how I would tend to understand this. As I said, it's somewhat ambiguous, even in Hebrew, as I understand it, Hebrew leaves me wondering for sure whether or not I have a good interpretation of this. But that's basically the context of what we're talking about. And there's the connection between his being blinded and God looking carefully and closely to see when Moses would be born. The Yesh Mefashim, and there are those who interpret Shtom Ha'ayin, that this term Shtom Ha'ayin, Patuach Ha'ayin, that his eyes were open, in other words, to see visions and prophecy, etc. And that's what we mean by being open-eyed, as to knowing what the future was going to be. And I think in English as well, when you talk about someone being open-eyed, it means that they have a deeper perception of things. The Moshe Tuvet, and we already translated the Opulos, right? The Al Sha'amar Shtum Ha'ayin, and because he used this term Shtum Ha'ayin, Lo Amar Shtum Ha'ainayin, but he didn't say Shtum Ha'ainayin, that both his eyes were shatum. In other words, that both his eyes were open. Lamadne, we can infer Shetsuma that he was blind in one of his eyes. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. I'm going to stop the share and see if anyone has any comments or questions. And it's wonderful to see them. So any comments or questions for the record? Me?
No, it's very much a summary of the commentary in the Talmud, and
Okay. Yes.
I think that's what you have to bear in mind.
Right. Absolutely. No, this
Yeah,
is part of the great work that Rashi did when you think about it, is
yeah,
that he had, because it's only, as someone has pointed out many, many years before, that it's only when you have such a mastery of this complex material that you can try and express it in straightforward kinds of ways. And that's part of the greatness of Maimonides when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, where he
yes,
takes all of rabbinic knowledge at the time and puts it in straightforward and gorgeous Hebrew in a very straightforward manner because he had mastered it. So he's such
yes.
a thing. Okay, that means